I have a couple different makes for you today. First, we're going to use some simple washi tape ideas and we'll spruce that up. We'll use some leftover washi tapes for a bonus project. Then we're going to get Inky using a unique stamping technique for a distressed look. And then we're going to tidy it up with a simple stenciling technique and a very good tool to get the job done. Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty, where I create with paper and photos in artful ways. Once a month, as part of the design team over at the Counterfeit Kit Challenge, we build kits and then we do a project called the Forgery on the 4th, where we are inspired by those kits to create our own products. And I really want to reproduce this striped paper. I put a bunch of washi tape in my kit specifically because I knew I was going to do that. If you want to see my kit build, you can click in the link up there in the corner or down in the description. And I will go ahead and start off this project with just a plain white sheet of 12 by 12 cardstock. I've got all of my washi tapes kind of in an array of greens, blues, and teals because that match the inspiration and because I like them. And I want to say that this is a great project if you are a collector of washi tape, but not so much a user of washi tape. This is a fun idea. And in fact, I almost wanted to kind of mix it up a little bit and go on the diagonal of this paper, but I stuck pretty close to the inspiration for this one. And as I put down this first stripe, I used up a roll of washi tape. How often does that happen, huh? So I am just going to continue with this process. I won't show you the whole thing. I will just give you a couple of tips and tricks as I go. So sometimes I will use 2 strips of washi like I did up there at the top, and then I'm repeating this down here at the bottom. Some patterns are easy to line up the graphics so that they look continuous, and that depends on the washi because it is printed in sections actually, and those sections repeat along the roll. So sometimes you'll have strange places where the patterns don't meet up, but just keep going, keep working with it. This stripe pattern in particular is very good for repeating patterns. I've got this one that it's hard to tell, but it has kind of this X shape to it, and those X's can line up to create kind of a diamond pattern. I will also overlap washi. If the edges of the pattern aren't matching up, I can overlap them and keep them going so that it does create a continuous pattern. And you'll notice I am using some glue along this process. If you have washi tape that's a bit on the old side, it might have lost some of its tack, or the opposite could be true. It may have gotten so tacky that it's hard to peel off the roll. So just pull it off slowly and work slowly. This doesn't take too long, but it does take a little bit. Once you have a first row that's nice and straight, the rest of the rows go pretty easily. And that's why I started with that one green row in the middle. Plus that was the washi tape that I knew I was going to run out of first. So I started off with that one. All right, I purposely overlapped these edges both because it was tactically easier to do that and also because it helps hold down that paper as I go. But I am kind of a frugal crafter at times, and I didn't want to waste the edges of the washi tape that I was going to cut off. So I just pulled out another piece of cardstock, and as you can see, I lined up those scraps on the top and the bottom, and we'll get to that. With my finished pattern paper, I will take that over to the sewing machine in a minute and show you what I do to add some detail to that. In the meantime, I am cutting this scratch piece of paper down to varying sizes. I cut it in the middle, but I kind of offset it so it's not exactly half and half. It's kind of like 1/3, 2/3. And then I'm going to mark the corners. I like to do 1/2 inch marks on the larger pieces, but on these smaller pieces, I like to do more of like a 1/4 inch mark. And then I will just clip those off with scissors. I mark that all on the back so that you won't see that in the end. Here is what my pattern paper looked like when I brought it back from my sewing machine. I did, the tension on my sewing machine is loose, and I didn't intend for that to be the case, but it turned out to have some wonderful texture because the stitching is really imperfect. So if you're looking for something purposeful like that, loosen up your tension. And then here's just a quick peek at how all those tags looked when they were finished up, and I like having the various widths, heights, and sizes. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our Inky technique. This first one is going to be a little bit more messy, and then I'll have a second one that's tidier if you're not that super distressed kind of person. I do want to be careful about which side of this paper I'm going to work on because I'm going to do this unique stamping technique. I'm setting those supplies off to the side for the second technique, so we're going to start with this stamping technique. And I'm going to use an embossing folder as a stamp. I did do some sample runs of my embossing folders. This particular one was done with a 3D embossing folder, and it did not give me the texture that I was expecting because the layers of the plastic in the 3D folder don't equal the full pattern. So when you're stamping with it, you won't get the full texture. If you want what you see on the embossing folder to come out on a stamp idea, then you want to use a regular embossing folder. The only one that I had that had the pattern that I wanted is this tiny one. So this is going to take me a little extra time, and it ends up being a little extra messy. And that's partially because of the ink. However, we do need to use either the Distress Oxide inks or some kind of pigment ink for this, because any water-based ink will just bead up on the plastic and you won't get the image very clearly. Now, I'm explaining here how embossing folders have two different sides. They have kind of a belly button outy side, which pushes the pattern in, and then they have a smooth side with recesses that the pattern pushes into. So here's what those two look like. This one is the belly button outy, and the one on the left there is the belly button innie. So I like to use the outy side because that acts more like an actual stamp. I am going to mark the back side of this embossing folder with a little piece of washi tape so that I can keep track of where I'm working if I need to set it down or walk away for any reason. So that will help me keep track. Let's go back to talking about this ink. The Oxide or a pigment ink is much creamier and stickier, so you're going to have a lot more luck getting a clear impression. But with this ink, you do want to kind of brush it across the surface of your embossing folder so that it will spread the ink nicely. But the thing about oxides and pigment inks is that they dry slower, which means it's going to be more likely that you will smudge it if you touch it, and we'll see that happen to me in just a couple minutes. So there was my first run of the stamping, and I like the imperfection of it. That's a good word for it, because the original piece was a bit on the distressed side already, and so I'm hoping for a distressed look. Now, this pattern in particular is a very repeatable pattern, so I can line up the bottom edge of that stencil over the top edge of the previous stamping and go ahead and stamp my next image, and it's going to pretty much look like is just a continuous pattern. You can see a little bit of a gap, and that is where I smudged the first one. So if you don't want these smudges to happen, go ahead and heat set the pigment ink in between each stamp. Now, like I said, my embossing folder is particularly little. Doing this with a full-size embossing folder will mean it will take less time and you will need less time to heat set and so on and so forth. But this is what I had, so this is what I'm working with, and this was the struggle that I dealt with because it turned out to be a bit messy. The other thing that I would recommend is cleaning off your mat underneath you as you go, because I was tending to pick up that ink on the edges of my hand and so on and so forth, and transferring that ink onto my paper. So it ended up being way more distressed than I intended, but I'm okay with that because some projects go for that look. Here, when I got to the very edge of this again, it was a really repeatable pattern, so it was easy to just fill in the blanks there. I am working on a silicone mat, and that provides two things. It gives a little squish because the embossing folder is not a stamp, it's not set up to that, but the little bit of squish from the mat helps the image transfer better, and also it helps keep my surface cleaner because I can just take that mat to the sink and wash it off. And in fact, you can see that it's easy to clean off there just because the ink will react with the water and bead up. But I'm going to use some of that ink to make some of the mistakes on here look a little more purposeful with some intended splatters on there. So that's going to kind of help tie things in together. I will add splatters to any gaps of the stamping that look too big and cover up any areas that look bad. All right, I did go ahead and heat set that off camera, and I flipped my paper over. You can see the other side is already a bit messy because it's picked up ink from that mat as I was working on the previous side. However, that level of mess isn't going to make this side look extra distressed. It's just going to kind of be a background grunginess to it. So what I really like when I'm doing a full sheet of stenciling is these paper pouncers from Picket Fence. You can see this one I've used a blue ink on. I have just a couple of these. I didn't feel the need to buy one for every color. I'm making sure that that ink is completely dry. I'm using a dark color, so even if it's not completely dry, this what is it called? Black soot is the distress ink color. The black soot is going to cover up any blue that might show through. So I'm just getting my Pouncer nice and juicy, and what I love about these as opposed to blending brushes is that they release the ink and transfer the ink very easily. So this, I believe, is sped up a little bit, but we'll hit a section that is in real time, and you can see how simple this is. Also, I'm working with a larger stencil so that it's going to cover the entirety of my paper much easier. Again, this is a very repeatable pattern, so it's going to be easy to line up the sections as I move the stencil around. So you can see how quick that paper pouncer made blending this stencil through. And you can see some of the distressedness where some areas of the image are darker and some areas are lighter, but it doesn't look totally grungy like the other side does. So I really like using these paper pouncers for this because it does give you that depth of color without a lot of effort. It's so easy. And you can see here that I kind of pounce color around on the stencil, and then I will start kind of swiping it. You have to be careful to swipe in the direction, and I didn't tape my stencil down, so I want to be sure to swipe in the direction that has some tension on the stencil so it doesn't move on me. And then when I was going to line up the next section, I realized that I couldn't see through the ink, but I know that I can see through the actual stencil itself. So I will just do a quick clean. And this is another thing about those paper pouncers that I like. It has a little tray and a cap to it so that when you set it down, it's not going to get anything else inky. So I like those paper pouncers for certain jobs, and I would recommend having 1 or 2 of them in your stash for doing these kinds of things if you're into some of that mixed media vibe. With the stencils and the paper pouncers, you can do some really beautiful stenciling and not be messy, so you can have some tidy stenciling. All right, with my stencil cleaned off, I just wiped it down with my rag. Now I can see through the stencil to line it up with the adjacent pattern so that my little chevrons are hitting with a chevron next door to it. And here I go, I just pounce on some more color, and then I will swipe that color across. All right, I did go ahead and finish up that side. I will heat set this off camera and make sure everything is nice and dry. I did do this on the back side of that first one. I used the textured side of the paper for this technique, and I used the smooth side for the stamping technique because that'll give you better results. And so this is a double-sided piece of pattern paper that I created with similar techniques and a couple of good tools. Here is an overview of everything that we created today. As I leave you with these close-ups, I want to say thank you very much for being here and for watching. I hope you got something useful out of this video, and I hope you'll come join us over at the Counterfeit Kit Challenge. All the links are down below. Until I am back with you next time, I hope you have an artful day.